Will Geer never got to say goodbye to his television family on screen. The man who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, one of the most beloved patriarchs in American television history, died in April 1978, and the show he helped make legendary had to write his absence into the story before the cameras ever rolled again. That single fact tells you something important about the Waltons that most casual viewers never realized while they were watching Sunday nights unfold on CBS. This wasn't just a show about a fictional family weathering the Great Depression and World War II in rural Virginia. It was a production shaped, again and again, by the real lives, real illnesses, real ambitions, and real heartbreaks of the actors who inhabited it. And when you start pulling on those threads, the story of why so many members of the Walton family left the show becomes far more layered than simple cast turnover. The Waltons premiered in 1972, based on the childhood memories of writer Earl Hamner Jr., who grew up in Schuyler, Virginia, and later became the show's creator and the voice of the adult John Boy narrating each episode. From the beginning, the series was praised for its warmth, its moral seriousness, and its refusal to condescend to its audience. It won Emmy Awards, it topped ratings charts, and it turned a cast of relatively unknown actors into household names. But behind that wholesome image was a production dealing with the same pressures every long-running drama faces. Actors growing restless, health crises striking without warning, and the tension between playing beloved characters forever and building an independent career. Richard Thomas, who played John Boy Walton, the eldest son and the show's emotional center, was the first major departure, and his exit set the tone for how the public would eventually understand cast changes on this series. Thomas left after the 1976-77 season, the show's fifth, at a moment when the character of John Boy was arguably more central to the show's identity than any other role. Thomas has spoken in interviews over the years about wanting to avoid being permanently defined by a single character, a concern shared by countless young actors who achieve early, overwhelming success in one role. He wanted to test himself in film and in other dramatic work, to prove there was range beyond the earnest, bookish aspiring writer that audiences had grown to love. It was not a decision made in anger or amid scandal. It was, by most accounts, a calculated and deeply personal choice about the shape he wanted his career to take, made at a moment when television actors were increasingly aware of the risk of typecasting following the model of stars from earlier decades who had struggled to shed a signature role. The production did not simply write John Boy out of existence. The character was too essential to the show's narrative structure, since the entire series was framed as his memories, narrated by an older version of himself. So the producers made an unusual choice. They recast the role, first with actor Robert Whiteman stepping into the part. This kind of recasting, especially of a show's central character, was uncommon enough in the 1970s that it generated real attention from television critics and fans, many of whom struggled to accept a new actor playing such a familiar face. It's a moment worth sitting with, because it reveals something the show's cozy, nostalgic image tends to obscure. The Waltons was not immune to the same identity crises and creative disruptions that plague any series lasting nearly a decade. It had to adapt, sometimes clumsily, to the real desires of the people bringing its characters to life. Ellen Corby's story is harder and sadder than Thomas's. Corby played Grandma Esther Walton, the sharp-tongued, deeply devout matriarch whose relationship with her husband Zebulon anchored much of the show's older generation warmth. In 1976, Corby suffered a serious stroke that affected her speech and mobility. This was not a career decision. It was a medical emergency that could have ended her time on the show entirely. Instead, in a move that reflected both the era's approach to disability and the show's genuine affection for its cast, the producers wrote Corby's real-life condition into the storyline. Grandma Walton was shown recovering from a stroke on screen. Her halting speech and altered movement mirrored Corby's own recovery in real time. It was an unusual, almost documentary-like blending of actor and character, and while some modern critics have debated whether this choice exploited a vulnerable moment in Corby's life, others have noted that it allowed her to remain part of the show she loved rather than being quietly replaced. Corby continued to appear in a reduced capacity for several more years, though her presence was never quite what it had been before the stroke, and this shift in her health visibly altered the show's tone in the scenes she appeared in. Will Geer's death is the most somber chapter in this history. Gear, who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, had lived an extraordinary life before ever setting foot on the Walton set, including a period in the 1950s when he was blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political associations, unable to find steady acting work in Hollywood for years. His casting in the Waltons in the early 1970s represented something of a late-career renaissance, and audiences embraced him as the warm, wise grandfather figure of the Walton household. Gear died on April 22, 1978, from respiratory failure, and the show's writers were faced with an impossible task. How do you continue a series about a tightly bonded family when one of its most beloved figures is suddenly, permanently gone? The decision was made to have Grandpa Walton die within the show's fictional timeline as well, and the episode dealing with his death remains one of the most emotionally devastating hours of television the series ever produced. It was not a plot twist engineered for ratings. It was a cast and crew grieving in real time, translating that grief into the fabric of the story, because there was no other way forward. Michael Learn's departure came later and under different circumstances entirely, closer in spirit to Richard Thomas's decision than to Corby's or Gear's medical hardships. Learn played Olivia Walton, the family's steady, principled mother, for the majority of the series' run, and her performance earned her multiple Emmy Awards. By the show's 8th season, however, Learn had decided she wanted to step away from a role that had come to define her public identity for nearly a decade. The show wrote this departure into its narrative by having Olivia Walton contract tuberculosis and travel to Arizona for treatment, an extended absence that mirrored Learn's own wish to be away from set for long stretches while she explored other work. This is a pattern worth noticing across several of these departures. Rather than simply killing off characters or writing them out with a vague explanation, the producers often chose to weave the real reasons for an actor's absence into the illness, recovery, or personal journey of their character, blurring the line between the Walton family's fictional struggles and the very real struggles of the people portraying them. Learn did return for guest appearances and later television movies, suggesting her departure, unlike Thomas's initial exit or Gear's death, was never meant to be a permanent goodbye but rather a pause, a chance to breathe outside the enormous shadow of a single defining role. Ralph Waite, who played John Walton Sr., the family patriarch and moral backbone of the series, remained with the show for nearly its entire run, a rare example of stability amid the turnover surrounding him. Waite's commitment to the role, and his reported closeness with the rest of the cast, made him something of a steadying presence through all the changes happening around him, from Thomas's exit to Corby's health struggles to Gear's death to Learn's temporary departure. Waite would later speak about the show's family-like atmosphere on set, describing bonds among the cast that extended well beyond the soundstage, which perhaps explains why so many of the actors, even after leaving, found their way back for reunion specials and television movies throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The younger cast members, meanwhile, largely stayed with the series through its natural conclusion in 1981, though their characters underwent enormous changes as the actors themselves grew from children into young adults in real time. Judy Norton, who played Mary Ellen, John Walmsley, who played Jason, Mary McDonough, who played Aaron, Eric Scott, who played Ben, David W. Harper, who played Jim Bob, and Cami Cotler, who played Elizabeth, all effectively grew up on screen, and the show's writers had to continually adjust storylines to reflect actors who were no longer children but teenagers and young adults navigating their own lives both on camera and off. This kind of organic aging is rare in television, and it created its own quiet pressures, since these actors were essentially asked to remain in the same roles through every stage of adolescence, a commitment that required its own kind of sacrifice, even if it didn't result in the dramatic exits of Thomas, Corby, Gear, or Learn. When you step back and look at the full picture, what emerges is not a story of a troubled or unhappy production, but rather a story of a show that had to constantly negotiate between the fictional world it was building and the unavoidable realities of the human beings building it. Richard Thomas left because he wanted a career beyond one character, a decision that television historians and biographers have since framed as an early and prescient example of an actor managing his own image in an era before that kind of career planning was common practice among young television stars. Ellen Corby's stroke forced the show to confront disability on screen in a way few series of that era attempted, whether or not that choice sits comfortably with modern audiences. Will Gear's death ask the cast and crew to grieve publicly, translating loss into some of the most quietly powerful storytelling the series ever produced? And Michael Learn's decision to step back reflected the same tension Thomas had felt years earlier, the desire to not be permanently absorbed by a role, however beloved, however award-winning. What makes the Waltons unusual in retrospect is how transparently these real-life circumstances shaped the show's storytelling rather than being hidden behind vague scripting excuses. Few series of that era, or even now, were willing to write an actor's actual stroke recovery into a character's arc, or to let a family's real grief over a colleague's death become part of the show's emotional architecture. It suggests a production, led by Earl Hamner Jr.'s vision of home, faith, and endurance through hardship, that extended its own values behind the camera as much as in front of it. The Waltons was always, at its heart, a show about a family finding ways to hold together through loss, illness, ambition, and change. It turns out the cast living through those very same forces in their own lives may be part of why the show felt so achingly real to the millions who tuned in every week, and why, decades later, audiences still return to Walton's Mountain not just for nostalgia, but for the quiet, hard-won truth that families, even television ones, are held together by people who sometimes have to leave in order to come home again. Given the density of verified, fact-checkable material on this topic, I want to flag something honestly rather than pad the script with speculation. The verifiable public record on the Waltons' cast departures: Richard Thomas, Ellen Corby, Will Geer, Michael Learned, Ralph Waite, and the younger ensemble, supports a script of roughly 2,000 to 2,200 words without drifting into invented details, fabricated quotes, or unverifiable insider claims. Stretching this specific topic to a strict 3,000 words while keeping every claim authentic would require either repeating points, violating your no repetition rule, or inventing details not in the historical record, violating your no fabrication rule. If you'd like, I can expand it to 3,000 words by folding in adjacent, well-documented material, such as the show's ratings decline in later seasons, Earl Hamner Jr.'s own biography and his relationship with the real Walton family, or the various reunion TV movies from the 1980s and 90s, which would let me hit the word count without fabricating anything. Let me know if you'd like me to do that. Pass.